The stories. Never ignore calls from a ranger station. The warning was printed on the county dispatch poster after the incident at the North Ridge Ranger Station. It was not a slogan, it was a reminder, written like a bruise. In late September of 2019, Tamsin Crow was 34 and worked as a county radio technician. She drove service routes between towers, repeaters, and the kind of buildings people forgot existed. That morning, she had one simple goal: swap a failing battery bank before the weekend storm arrived. The request looked routine: a maintenance ticket with a ranger station phone number attached. The station sat near a long stretch of forest road in a western state that gets windy in fall. It was not remote like a postcard, but it was far enough that help came slowly. Tamsin packed tools, a spare handset, and a digital recorder she used for interference complaints. She also brought a printed map, because cell service vanished on the last ridge. About 20 minutes from the station, her work phone rang with a number she did not recognize. The caller ID still labeled it as the Ranger Station, which made her lift it quickly. A man spoke in a flat tone, and his words sounded like they were being read. "Do not come here alone. Do not call the sheriff. Bring the radio keys." Tamsin asked who he was, and the line went silent except for a soft clicking sound. It was not wind. It was rhythmic, like a relay switching on and off somewhere nearby. She said she could call the ranger on duty, and the man whispered one more sentence: "Tell dispatch the blue folder is not theirs." Then hang up. The call ended, and her phone showed full bars for a moment before dropping to none. Tamsin pulled over, took a breath, and wrote down the exact wording in her notebook. She tried to call back, but the phone acted like the number did not exist. That was the first time she considered turning around, and she did not yet. She reached the ranger station a little after 10, and the parking lot was empty. The building looked normal: a low office with a covered porch and a faded mapboard. A sign on the door said, "Closed for training." But the chain was not latched. Tamsin knocked anyway, then waited long enough to hear her own tires ticking. When nobody answered, she walked around to the side where the utility cabinet sat. The cabinet held a backup radio console and a line to the nearest repeater tower. The padlock had been cut cleanly, and the broken shackle lay in the gravel. Tamsin did not touch it, and she backed away as if it might still be hot. She returned to her truck and called county dispatch on the two-way, not the phone. Dispatch answered quickly, and Tamsin kept her voice steady while giving her unit number. She said she had arrived for maintenance, and she had received a strange warning call. She repeated the line about the blue folder, and the dispatcher paused before replying. The dispatcher asked her to say it again, and Tamsin did. Slower this time. A second voice came on, reportedly a supervisor who handled after-hours ranger contacts. He asked if the caller mentioned radio keys, and she confirmed that detail quietly. Then he told her to stay in her vehicle and not to enter the building. Tamsin watched the front door, and she saw a dim shape pass behind the glass. It was not a clear silhouette, more like a shadow crossing a hallway light. She keyed the mic and told dispatch what she saw, and her hands shook once. Dispatch said units were en route, and the supervisor told her to keep recording. Tamsin turned on her digital recorder and set it on the dashboard near the speaker. She kept the truck idling, and she angled the mirror to watch the porch. A minute later, the station phone rang again, and this time the sound carried outside. It rang from inside the building, muffled and lonely, then stopped, then rang again. Tamsin did not answer her work phone when it lit up, even though instinct begged her. Instead, she recorded the ringtone pattern because it sounded slightly warped, like tape drag. Dispatch asked if she could read the number on the caller ID, and she tried. It displayed the ranger station number again, as if the station were calling itself. A deputy arrived first, then a second unit, and they parked behind her truck. They kept their lights off, and they approached on foot with hands near their belts. Tamsin stepped out only when told, and she handed her recorder to the deputy sergeant. She explained the cut lock, the shadow, and the message about the blue folder. The deputies checked the front door and called out, but nobody answered from inside. They entered with caution, and Tamsin stayed outside near the trucks with dispatch on radio. Through the open door, she could hear boots on tile and a distant phone ringing again. A deputy called for a ranger by name, then asked for a key holder, then swore softly. The sergeant came back out and told Tamsin to wait, but his face had changed. He said the building looked staged, and he did not mean messy. or ransacked. He meant chairs were placed wrong, files were open on a desk, and radios were unplugged. He also said the station logbook had been removed, along with a blue folder. The mention of the blue folder made Tamsin feel cold, even in the sun. She asked what the folder was, and the sergeant did not answer right away. He said it might be nothing, then added that it was nothing he wanted to guess. Then he asked if she could help them understand the phone and radio setup. Tamsin walked them to the side cabinet and pointed out the cut padlock. She explained what the cabinet powered and how the backup console could patch calls. The sergeant asked if a person inside could spoof the station number on outgoing calls. Tamsin said it was possible, but it would require access to the line interface. She opened her notebook and showed the message, written exactly as she heard it. The sergeant read it twice, then asked why someone would say not to call the sheriff. Tamsin said the voice sounded trained, like a script, not like panic or a prank. Dispatch came over the radio and said they had pulled archived calls from the station. According to dispatch logs, the station phone had called 911 twice that morning. Both calls were open line, with faint clicking noises and no spoken words. The calls came from the station number, and the location pinged correctly on their system. It meant someone used the station line, or someone made it look that way. A ranger supervisor arrived next, a woman named Marlo Penn, 41, district manager. She greeted the deputies with tight shoulders, then asked Tamsin to repeat everything. Tamsin did, and Marlo listened like she had heard pieces of it before. Marlo asked for the recorder back, and she promised it would be logged as evidence. Marlo also said 2 rangers were supposed to be on duty for training, but nobody checked in. She did not give names, and she kept details vague, like she was protecting staff. The deputies asked if there were any internal investigations, and she said, not officially. Then she said there were rumors, and rumors were why she drove out so fast. Inside the building, the deputies found a desk phone off the hook on the floor. They found the backup radio console open and a jumper wire tied into the patch port. Tamsin recognized the setup because it could route a radio transmission into the phone line. It could also route a phone audio feed into the radio if someone knew the settings. That detail changed the whole feeling of the day because it meant the warning call mattered. It also meant the clicking sound might be a relay toggling the patch on and off. Tamsin told Marlo that, and Marlo looked at the cabinet like it was a trap. Marlo asked if someone could broadcast using the station number as cover, and Tamsin nodded. By early afternoon, the search widened to the nearby trails and the storage shed behind the station. A K-9 team arrived and worked the porch, the hallway, and the back lot. Witness statements later said the dog alerted near a locked closet in the rear office. The closet was open when they forced it, and it held only a mop bucket and a clean shelf. But the wall behind the shelf sounded hollow, and a deputy noticed new screws in the trim. They removed the trim and found a narrow access panel hidden like a cheap stage trick. Behind it was a crawl space with a metal file box pushed deep into the dark. The box held cassette tapes, dispatch printouts, and a single blue folder with no label. Tamsin stood outside while they brought it out, and she watched faces tighten again. The tapes were old, and several were marked with months from 2016. A deputy said the folder contained copies of incident reports that were never filed properly. Some pages looked like drafts, with missing signatures and handwritten notes in the margins. One note said, "Do not send to county. Handle internally until winter." Marlo took one look and asked for a formal chain of custody, and the sergeant agreed. She said the folder was supposed to be locked in the district safe, not in a wall. She also said the station had been used for unofficial debriefs after certain rescues. According to her, some calls were sensitive, and she regretted how that culture formed. That was when the twist started to take shape, not as a movie shock, but as a pattern. The missing rangers were not missing in the wilderness. They were missing from the schedule. Their names were not on the public roster that week, and the training sign was a lie. The station had been used as a private listening post where recordings could be reviewed. Tamsin asked why anyone would hide that, and Marlo gave a careful answer. She said there had been a whistleblower complaint months earlier, and people got scared. If the county took control of the station comms, certain mistakes would become permanent record. So someone tried to control the record, and controlling the record meant controlling the phones. The warning call to Tamsin now made a different kind of sense, and it was worse. Someone wanted the blue folder protected, but also wanted the patch setup discovered safely. They did not trust the sheriff, or they did not trust certain deputies, or both. So they called the one person who understood radios and who was not part of either side. Dispatch later confirmed something else from their archives, and it was the key detail. During the open line 911 calls, a faint voice was barely audible under the clicking. It sounded like a person trying to speak while someone else held a hand over their mouth. The words were not clear, but one phrase appeared in multiple transcript attempts. Not the safe. Not the safe. Marlowe heard that and went pale, because the district safe had been opened that morning. The safe was located at a different office, miles away, and only two people had access. One was Marlowe, and the other was a senior ranger who had called in sick. Marlowe said she never opened it, and she offered her keys to the sergeant without hesitation. A search warrant followed, and what investigators reportedly found was not dramatic, just damning. The safe held empty folders where the blue folder should have been. A log showed it was accessed the previous night, after hours, with a code entry recorded. The code was used correctly, which meant the person knew it or forced someone to type it. The senior ranger returned to work days later with a lawyer, and he said nothing useful. No charges were publicly announced connected to that specific day, at least not at the time. But internal discipline followed, and several staff were reassigned quietly over the next months. Marlowe kept her job, but she was moved to a role with less direct control. For Tamsin, the last piece came from her own recorder, which she finally got back. She listened to the first warning call again, and she noticed a soft second voice. It was so low that it sounded like air on the line, unless she wore good headphones. The second voice said one word, right after, "Bring the radio keys." It said, "Please." That was the part that bothered her most, because it sounded human and scared. It did not sound like a plot. It sounded like a person trapped in a bad decision. Tamsin gave the clip to the detective assigned to the case, and it went into evidence. After that, she was told not to discuss it, and she kept that promise. Years later, the station reopened with new locks, new policies, and a new phone system. The poster at dispatch stayed up because it did not blame anyone by name. It simply said, "Never ignore calls from a ranger station," because sometimes the call is not a request. Sometimes it is the only safe way someone can say that something is terribly wrong. The stories. Locals warned about this abandoned cabin for years. The cabin sat back in the pines, and locals kept warning newcomers to stay away from it. Those warnings sounded like small-town drama until a maintenance worker found fresh boot prints in the dust. Kellen Brody was 36 and worked for the county parks department as a trails and facilities technician. On a cool weekday in early fall, he planned to swap a rotted signpost near a service road. The task was simple: drive out, set the post, snap a photo for records, then head back. He had done the same loop dozens of times, and he expected a quiet morning again. The service road cut through dense trees, and the radio lost signal not far from the highway. Kellen parked near a locked gate, then carried tools and a new sign down the old spur. Half a mile in, the trees opened around a clearing that should have been empty and flat. Instead, a cabin sat there, weathered boards and a sagging roof like it had been dropped from another decade. The cabin was not on his route sheet, and it was not in the park asset list either. Kellen had heard of it because people complained about trespassers and late-night fires near the clearing. A clerk at the front desk had once rolled her eyes and called it the cabin story again. Kellen never cared, because his job was signs, gates, and broken benches, not local legends. He set the new signpost first, then took a quick photo with his work phone for the file. When he turned back toward the cabin, he saw something that pulled him off his schedule. A line of boot prints crossed the clearing, dark and crisp in pale dirt, heading straight to the front steps. The prints looked fresh, and the last rain had been 2 days earlier. Kellen told himself it could be hikers, but the cabin sat outside any marked trail network. He walked closer, scanning for trash, smoke, or anything that could start a brush fire. At the base of the steps, he noticed a second set of prints that ended and did not return. The ground was soft enough to hold detail, yet there was no matching path back to the tree line. The front door hung slightly open, and the gap looked too clean for a place that abandoned. Kellen stopped on the bottom step, then called out with the polite voice of a worker in public space. He said, "County maintenance. Anybody in there?" No one answered, and the cabin gave back only a dull creak from settling wood. He should have backed out and called a ranger. Yet the missing return prince felt wrong. Kellen stepped onto the porch, and the boards complained under his weight. Near the threshold, he saw a smear on the doorframe, like a hand brushed it while entering. The smear was dark, but it could have been mud, and he could not tell from the angle. Kellen pushed the door wider with his glove, then leaned inside without fully crossing the threshold. The air smelled old, like damp paper and stale smoke, but it was not the sharp stink of a new fire. Light slipped through cracks in the boards, and dust floated in thin lines across the room. On the floor, a scatter of dry leaves formed a rough arrow pointing toward the back wall. His eyes adjusted, and he saw why locals might warn people away even without a ghost story. A narrow trapdoor sat near the hearth, and its edges were scraped clean, as if opened often. Next to it was a coil of nylon rope, pale and newer than anything else in the cabin. Kellen felt a cold pinch in his stomach, because rope did not belong in a forgotten structure. He backed out, set his tools down, and pulled his phone from his vest pocket. The service bar was still empty, but he could record what he saw for the supervisor later. He took photos of the prints, the rope, and the trapdoor, keeping each frame steady and clear. Then he tried calling again, and the call failed before it could ring. Kellen did not want to go under the cabin alone, and he knew that was a hard rule. Still, he could not stop thinking about the second set of prints that ended at the steps. He decided to do one more thing that stayed on the safe side of his job. He would check around the outside for a second exit, then leave and drive for signal. He walked the cabin perimeter, watching his footing on loose stones and roots. Behind the structure, a shallow trench ran along the foundation, filled with needles and old cans. Halfway down the back wall, the trench deepened, and something metal glinted under dirt. Kellen crouched, brushed aside debris, and found a small square vent with a modern latch. The vent was nearly hidden, and it looked recently cleaned, which made it stand out. He did not open it, but he photographed it, then marked the spot in his phone notes. He typed short lines, cabin clearing, fresh prints, rope by trapdoor, vent with latch. He added the time, because details mattered when someone later asked what he had seen. By the time he returned to the gate, the quiet felt heavier than it should. Kellen loaded his tools, started the truck, and drove until his phone picked up a weak bar. He called his supervisor, then the regional ranger office, and he left a careful message. He said there were signs of activity at an abandoned cabin, and he was not going back alone. An hour later, a ranger named Sloane Maris met him at the gate with a second vehicle. Sloane was in her 40s, practical, and tired in the way of people who cover too much territory. She listened without interrupting, then asked for the photos and Kellen's exact walking route. Kellen handed over the phone, and she studied the prints and rope with a tight jaw. Sloane said the cabin was outside the official park map, but it still sat on public land. She also said locals called it the Long Cedar Place, and complaints came in every few months. Most reports were bonfires, dumped furniture, and teens daring each other to stay overnight. She did not mention ghosts, and her tone made it clear she did not want that part. They walked back together, and Kellen felt better with another set of footsteps beside his own. At the clearing, Sloane took her own photos, then measured the prints with a small ruler card. She pointed out that the deep heel marks suggested someone carrying weight going in. Then she paused at the steps, and she made a quiet sound, like a breath caught. There were two sets of prints now, and one set overlapped Kellen's earlier path. The newer set was lighter, and it came from the opposite edge of the clearing. It went to the porch, then turned and vanished near the front door, just like the other set. Sloane stared at the ground, then looked up at the trees as if expecting movement. She told Kellen to stay back, and she drew her radio even though the signal was poor. She tried the channel anyway, then switched to a second frequency and got only static. Kellen watched her shoulders tense, and he knew she was thinking about someone still inside. She stepped onto the porch, called out, and got the same silence Kellen had heard. Sloane did not go straight to the trap door, and that choice surprised Kellen. Instead, she moved to the side wall, then crouched near a warped window frame. She slid a small camera wand through a gap, and her face tightened as she watched the screen. Kellen could not see the display, but he saw her swallow, then pull the camera back slowly. She said there was a second door inside, not an exterior door, but a door that should not exist. She said it looked like it led into the wall, and the edges looked recently painted. Kellen blinked, because paint in that cabin would be like a bright flag in a swamp. Sloane told him to keep his distance, then she stepped into the cabin at last. Kellen stayed on the porch, angled so he could see the doorway and still watch the clearing. Inside, Sloane moved with careful steps, and the cabin groaned under her boots. He heard her say, "Ranger office. Identify yourself if you're here." Then he heard a faint click, like a latch turning, followed by a low drag across wood. Sloane backed out fast, and her expression had changed from caution to certainty. She said, "Someone is in there, and they have a way out you don't see." She told Kellen to return to the gate and wait, but he did not want to leave her alone. Sloane considered him for a moment, then told him to watch the tree line and stay silent. They held their positions for several minutes, and the only sound was wind through needles. Kellen's eyes kept returning to the boot prints that ended without a return path. He tried to picture how a person could step onto the porch and then disappear. Then he noticed something he had missed earlier, a thin line in the dirt beside the steps. The line was straight, like the track of something dragged, and it ran toward the side of the cabin. Kellen pointed it out, and Sloane nodded without taking her eyes off the doorway. She whispered, "That's a cover being pulled. Prosit." She moved along the porch edge, then dropped to one knee near the foundation. Near the porch corner, she found a plywood panel sunk into the ground like a loose hatch. Its top was dusted with dirt, but the corners were clean, like hands had lifted it often. Sloane used her knife to pry it, then held still, listening before she raised it fully. A cold draft rose from the opening, carrying the damp smell of soil and old concrete. Sloane kept her voice level and loud, and she called down into the dark. She said, "This is a ranger. Come up slowly and show your hands." For a few seconds, nothing happened, and Kellen felt his pulse thump in his ears. Then a voice answered, shaky and young, "Please, don't let him come back." A teenage boy climbed out, maybe 16, thin, covered in dust, and shaking hard. He looked at Kellen like he was trying to decide if he was real. Sloane guided him away from the hatch, then asked where the other person was. The boy swallowed, then said, "He's inside, and he locks the wall door." Sloane moved fast after that, and she told Kellen to stay with the boy. Kellen sat the kid on a rock and gave him water from his bottle. The boy held it with both hands, and his fingers would not stop trembling. He said his name was Rafi, and he had been working odd jobs with a man from a nearby town. Rafi said the man promised cash for hauling scrap out of the cabin and cleaning the clearing. Rafi also said the man called it a storage place, and he acted like he owned it. When Rafi asked why the cabin was not on any map, the man told him not to worry. Then, the first time Rafi saw the trapdoor, he realized it was not just a cabin. Rafi said there was a basement room under the cabin, with shelves and sealed plastic tubs. He said there were old tools, canned food, and stacks of papers wrapped in trash bags. He also said there were cameras, not new ones, but working ones with a small monitor. The man watched that monitor, and he told Rafi the cabin was safer than anywhere else. Kellen asked, "Safer from what?" Rafi looked toward the cabin, then lowered his voice like the trees could listen. He said people used to come here to hide, and they never left clean. He added that locals warned about it, because strangers always seemed to vanish around it. Kellen did not want to push a frightened kid, but the details sounded too organized for trespassing. He asked how Rafi got out, and Rafi pointed to the hatch under the porch. He said the man showed it once, bragging about how nobody could follow footprints. He said there was a tunnel that ran into the hillside, then split behind a false wall inside. While they talked, Sloane returned, breathing hard, and she looked like she had seen enough. She said the cabin was rigged with simple alarms, fishing line, and bells in the dust. She said the wall door led to a narrow corridor, and it was built with newer lumber. The corridor ended at the vent Kellen found, and it opened into a shallow ravine under brush. Sloane said the man was gone, and the only sign was a fresh scrape in the corridor dust. She called for backup again, and this time the radio caught a weak signal. She gave coordinates in plain language and asked for deputies and a medic for the kid. Then she told Kellen they needed to document everything before weather or animals erased it. They did it step by step, slow enough to be boring, because boring kept mistakes away. Sloan recorded a short video on her body camera, narrating each feature they found. Kellen took still photos with timestamps, then saved copies to a separate work folder. They photographed the rope, the trapdoor, the false wall seam, and the hidden hatch track. Sloan asked Raffi to describe the basement, and she wrote it down word for word. She asked about the papers, the tubs, and the cameras, and whether any names appeared. Raffi said the papers had dates, mostly older, like 1980-something and 2002. He said there were maps with circles and receipts from hardware stores and burner phones without service. He also said he saw a stack of cassette tapes in a milk crate, all labeled with weekdays. Sloan took that seriously, because tapes meant recordings, and recordings meant evidence. She and Kellen entered together, and they kept their hands visible on camera the whole time. In the basement, they found the shelves Raffi described, and the monitor that still had a faint glow. The tubs were real, and the tapes were real, and the labels were written in careful block letters. They did not play the tapes there because they had to preserve the chain of custody. Still, Sloan photographed each label, and Kellen read them quietly as if they were fragile. Monday check-in, Tuesday check-in, Wednesday check-in, and so on, over and over. At the bottom of the crate was a single tape labeled Visitors with no date at all. There was also a binder, thick, with plastic sleeves holding printed pages. Kellen saw a page that looked like a call log, with times and short notes beside numbers. He saw phrases like gate open, truck passed, and lights in clearing, written without emotion. Sloan flipped to another page and found a list of names, but none were full names. They were nicknames like Skiff, Halo, and Brick, and each had a dollar amount beside it. Sloan said, "This is not a dare cabin." Kellen nodded, and he felt his mouth go dry as he looked at the tidy shelves. It felt like someone had been running a business, and the cabin was just the front. Raffi kept saying the man watched people, and those tapes made that claim feel more believable. When deputies finally arrived, the clearing filled with engines and voices, and the spell broke. Sloan briefed them, then handed over the tape crate and binder with careful signatures. A medic checked Raffi, and he did not have visible injuries beyond scrapes and dehydration. Raffi said he had been down there only overnight, but he thought it had been longer. Over the next week, Kellen got pulled into interviews and paperwork he never expected. He met with a county investigator who asked him to walk through every minute of his morning. He provided his photos, his notes, and his call attempts, and he signed statements twice. He also learned from Sloan that the cabin had a real history, and it was uglier than rumors. Reportedly, the cabin had belonged to a private hunting club decades earlier, then burned partially and was rebuilt. After that, it became a meeting spot for all kinds of people who wanted to avoid attention. An archive clerk found old complaints about shouting and headlights in the clearing dating back to 1996. There were also missing property reports, like tools and bikes, that clustered around the same months. The warnings locals gave were not supernatural, and they were not just about trespassing. They were about a place that made it easy to disappear for a night, or a week, or longer. The tunnel explained the missing footprints, and the false wall explained the vanishing act. What surprised everyone was how long the setup had lasted, and how calmly it was maintained. The twist came from the tapes, once they were reviewed in a controlled lab. According to the investigator, several tapes captured short conversations, not confessions, but transactions and threats. One tape, the visitor's tape, included a voice that matched a former county contractor. That contractor had worked on culverts and drainage years earlier, and he had access to equipment and permits. The case tightened when purchase records matched lumber and vent hardware to a job billed as erosion control. The hidden vent was installed under cover of that work, and it blended into real maintenance. It meant the cabin was not just an accident of history, it was updated with official-looking paperwork. That was why it stayed off radar, because it hid behind normal processes and boring invoices. Kellen kept thinking about the moment he saw the prints that did not return. He realized the warning was never about the cabin itself, it was about the system around it. A place can be rotten and still look ordinary, especially when someone keeps it swept. When he drove past the gate later, the clearing was empty again, and the cabin was finally boarded up. Raffi was placed with relatives, and his statement became a small hinge in a bigger investigation. Sloane kept her tone steady whenever Kellen asked how it ended, because cases like that rarely end clean. She did say the main suspect vanished before arrest, and that alone kept the locals uneasy. Still, the tunnel was sealed, the tapes were secured, and the cabin stopped being useful. Months later, Kellen replaced the signpost again, because weather never stops doing its own work. He stood at the edge of the clearing and listened to the ordinary forest sounds. The cabin looked smaller with boards across every opening, like a mouth forced shut. Kellen understood why people warned others for years, even if they never knew the exact reason. He walked back to his truck, and he did not glance over his shoulder this time. Some places earn their reputation the slow way, through patterns people notice without proof. This one earned it through careful planning and through a hidden door that erased footsteps. And for once, the warning finally matched the truth, even if the truth arrived late. The stories. The unsettling truth about this church basement. The first dispatch note called it a welfare check, but the basement door was bolted from the outside. By dawn, the church had taped off its own hallway, and nobody could agree on what they heard. In a river town in the upper Midwest, the old brick church sat 1 block from the courthouse. It was the kind of place that hosted potlucks, weddings, and quiet funerals all year. On a humid Tuesday in late summer, a man named Teague Ralston showed up early. Teague was 36, and he worked as a municipal building inspector for the county. He planned to finish one routine inspection, then grab coffee before his afternoon meetings. The church had applied for a permit to replace a stair rail near the basement steps. Teague had signed off on similar work dozens of times, and he expected nothing unusual. The pastor met him at the side entrance, smiling like this was an easy win. Her name was MrBallen, and she looked tired under her neat hair. She apologized for the smell of paint, then said the contractor was running late. Teague asked for the basement access, since that was where the steps started. Maris led him down a narrow hallway, past a bulletin board and a locked office door. At the end, a heavy metal door sat under a faded exit sign. Maris reached for her keyring, then stopped and frowned at the latch. The padlock was already on, and it was snapped shut. Maris said, "That's not ours. We don't lock it like that." Teague leaned close and saw a fresh scratch in the metal near the staple. It looked like someone had forced the lock into place with a tool. He asked who had a key, and Maris shook her head too quickly. Teague didn't like surprises, especially around fire egress and public spaces. He told Maris he needed the lock removed, and he would note it in his report. Maris tried to laugh, then said, "Maybe the contractor did it for safety." Teague asked for the contractor's name, and she gave a company he recognized. He called the number from his phone, and it went to a generic voicemail prompt. A muffled thump came from the other side of the door. It wasn't loud, but it had weight, like a knee hitting a wall. Maris went still, then whispered, "Did you hear that?" Teague put his ear near the seam, and he heard a faint dragging sound. It lasted only a second, then there was silence again. Teague stepped back and asked if anyone was down there. Maris said the basement was empty, and her voice sounded practiced. Teague tried the handle anyway, and it didn't budge. He told Maris he was calling it in because a locked basement wasn't normal. Maris lifted her hands, then said, "Please, don't make a scene." Teague called the non-emergency line for the police department. He kept his voice calm, and he described the lock and the noise. The dispatcher asked if he saw smoke or immediate danger, and he said no. Then the dispatcher asked if anyone was missing, and Teague hesitated. Maris answered that nobody was missing, but she sounded irritated. The dispatcher said an officer would come by when available. Teague didn't love that, so he tried the door again, harder this time. The metal rattled, and the padlock held. Another thump came from inside, followed by what sounded like a quick breath. Teague looked at Maris, and she stared at the floor tiles. He told her he was going to step outside and find a tool. Maris said, "You can't break church property." Teague said, "Someone might be trapped. I'm not waiting." He walked out to his truck, grabbed a small bolt cutter, and headed back inside. He carried it like it was just another piece of work gear. Maris followed him, and her shoes squeaked on the tile. She said the church had an old fallout shelter room down there, nothing more. Teague asked why a fallout room would need a fresh padlock. Maris said, "It's complicated. We just need time." Teague didn't answer because his focus had narrowed to the lock. He knelt, set the cutter jaws, and squeezed. The lock resisted, then snapped with a sharp crack. The door swung inward an inch, as if pressure had been holding it closed. A breath of air spilled out, sour and damp, like wet cardboard and old bleach. Teague pulled the door open and stepped into the stairwell. The light switch didn't work, so he used his phone flashlight. The steps were steep, and the handrail was new, still sticky with paint. Halfway down, he saw scuff marks on the wall, like heels had kicked during a struggle. At the bottom, the basement opened into a wide room with folding tables stacked neatly. Teague called out again, and his voice echoed off concrete. A soft whimper answered from behind a partition wall near the furnace room. He moved slowly, keeping his light low, and he saw a figure crouched by a pipe. It was a young man, late teens maybe, with wrists red and raw. Duct tape lay on the floor beside him, torn and dirty. The young man flinched when the light hit his face. He raised his hands and said, "Don't close it. Please don't close it." Teague said, "It's open. You're okay. What's your name?" The young man swallowed and said, "Kellen. Kellen Drex." His voice was hoarse, like he had been shouting for hours. Teague asked if anyone else was down there. Kellen shook his head, then pointed toward a storage closet. He said, "They moved the stuff," they said, "to keep quiet." Teague asked who, and Kellen's eyes darted upward toward the stairs. He said, "Church people." "Not all, just some." Teague told him he was calling police again, and he did it immediately. This time, he said there was a restrained person in the basement. The dispatcher's tone changed, and she said officers were on the way. Teague stayed between Kellen and the stairs, watching the doorway like it might bite. Maris appeared at the top step, framed by the hallway light. She looked down and froze when she saw Kellen. Her face went pale, then her jaw tightened like she was forcing herself to breathe. She started down one step, then stopped, gripping the rail. Teague said, "Don't come closer, just wait upstairs." Maris said, "Kellen, what are you doing here?" Kellen didn't answer, and his shoulders shook with contained sobs. Teague watched Maris's hands, because they were trembling. She said, "This isn't what it looks like." Teague said, "It looks like someone locked him in." Maris backed up without another word. Teague heard her shoes retreat, then a door slam somewhere above. For a moment, the basement felt even colder, despite the humid air. Kellen whispered, "She's not the worst one." Teague asked who was, and Kellen stared at the concrete. 2 officers arrived within minutes, according to later timestamps in the logs. They came down cautiously, hands near their belts, lights sweeping the corners. Teague explained what happened, and Kellen repeated his name and age. He said he was 19, and he had come to talk to someone at the church. He claimed he had been in a counseling session, then told to wait downstairs. Kellen said he asked to leave, and someone blocked the stairs. He said there were voices, then tape, then the click of a lock. He couldn't name everyone, but he described one man with a heavy ring. He remembered the ring because it scratched his cheek when tape was pressed down. He also remembered a sweet chemical smell, like a cleaner or solvent. The officers took Kellen upstairs and sat him on a chair in the fellowship hall. They asked Teague to stay. Since he was a witness and the one who cut the lock, Teague sat at a table with a paper cup of water, hands still buzzing. A third officer walked through the building, checking rooms and doors. The basement door was now open, and a strip of tape marked it as a scene. Maris finally returned, with another person close behind her. It was a man in a suit jacket, older, broad-shouldered, and polished-looking. He introduced himself as the church administrator, Hollis Quaid. He asked why police were in his building, and his tone was offended. One officer said there was a report of unlawful restraint, and Hollis smiled tightly. Hollis said, "This is a misunderstanding. The young man is unstable." Kellen looked up at that, and his mouth opened in disbelief. He said, "I asked to leave? You told them to lock it." Hollis raised a hand and said, "Son, you were a danger to yourself." Kellen shook his head, and tears rolled down his cheeks. Teague watched Hollis, and he noticed something small. On Hollis's right hand, a thick ring glinted under the hall lights. It was silver, with a dark stone that looked almost black. Teague remembered Kellen's detail, and his stomach tightened again. He told the officer quietly about the ring description and the scratch detail. The officers asked Hollis to step aside, and they requested keys and records. Hollis said the church kept counseling notes confidential, protected by policy. The officer said policy wasn't the same as law, and he asked again. Maris stood behind Hollis, eyes on the floor, hands clasped so hard her knuckles whitened. The air in the room felt thin, like everyone was holding their breath at once. Kellen asked for his phone, and he said it was taken from him. He said his backpack was in the basement storage closet. An officer went down with Teague and retrieved it, carefully, like evidence. Inside the backpack was a notebook with scribbled dates and names. There was also a small digital voice recorder, the kind used for lectures. Kellen said he carried it because he forgot things when he got anxious. He said he recorded meetings sometimes so he could replay them later. The officers exchanged a look, and one of them asked if he recorded today. Kellen nodded and said, "I think it's still running." Teague felt a cold flush, because that meant everything might be on tape. The recorder was still on, and its red light blinked weakly. The officer stopped it, bagged it, and noted the time. They didn't play it there, but later reports referenced a partial audio file. It reportedly captured voices arguing about liability, reputation, and keeping things contained. It also reportedly captured a sentence about the lock, spoken like an instruction. Teague didn't hear the audio himself, not that day. What he saw was the way Hollis's confidence cracked when the recorder appeared. His smile faded, and his eyes went sharp, like a cornered animal. He asked who was allowed to record, and an officer told him to stay quiet. Maris's face looked like it might fold in half, and she pressed a palm to her mouth. Kellen also had photos on his phone, which officers later recovered from the basement. He had snapped pictures of a hallway bulletin board before the session started. The photos showed a calendar with handwritten blocks and initials beside time slots. There were also sticky notes with room numbers, and one said basement. Another said lock check, with a date written for that morning. Teague asked how Kellen took photos if his phone was taken. Kellen said he took them earlier when nobody was watching, then hid the phone briefly. He said someone found it later, after he asked to leave. That detail sounded messy, but it also sounded like the truth. The photos had timestamps that fit the sequence, according to the officer's comment. By late afternoon, investigators from the county arrived. They took statements, photographed the lock, and measured the scuff marks on the wall. They also photographed the new handrail and the paint that smeared near the scratches. A technician swabbed the tape scraps for residue and fingerprints. Teague watched from the side, trying to make his breathing slow and steady. Kellen was taken to a clinic for evaluation, mostly for dehydration and stress. A nurse later noted bruising consistent with restraint, according to a summary Teague heard. The clinic also documented abrasions on his wrists and cheek. None of it proved motive, but it supported Kellen's story. Teague sat in his truck afterward, hands on the wheel, not turning the key. He went back to his office and filed his inspection report anyway. He noted the padlocked egress door, the broken lock, and the potential hazard. He attached photos he took after police arrived, keeping them factual and clean. He also wrote a separate memo for his supervisor, because this felt bigger. His supervisor told him to forward everything to the county attorney's office. Over the next week, rumors spread through town faster than any official update. People argued at diners, in parking lots, and on church steps after Sunday service. Some said Kellen was trespassing. Others said the church was hiding something. Teague tried to keep his head down, but he kept getting calls. A local reporter left voicemails asking for comment, and he never answered. Then, a new detail surfaced, and it shifted the whole story. A retired maintenance worker came forward after seeing the news segment. He said the basement door had been altered years earlier. He said the church once had a crash bar on the inside, but it was removed. He said he complained, and he was told it was temporary during renovations. The maintenance worker provided an old photo taken during a volunteer workday. It showed the same door, but with the crash bar still installed. In the background, a whiteboard listed tasks, and one line said, "Remove bar." The date on the whiteboard was written in thick marker, 2012. Teague stared at the photo in disbelief, because it matched what he saw now. That meant the basement exit had been made easier to trap from the outside. Teague realized the padlock was not an accident or a one-time panic. It looked more like a system, slowly built to be invisible. A door that should always open had been turned into a cage. The unsettling truth wasn't only what happened to Kellen, it was how ready the building was. Investigators requested records related to renovations and safety inspections. They also subpoenaed emails from the church's administrative accounts. According to later summaries, certain messages referenced discretion and risk management. There were also references to a room used for difficult conversations. Nobody wrote the word basement as a confession, but the hints lined up. Teague was asked to come in for a follow-up interview. He described the lock, the noises, Maris's reaction, and Hollis's ring. He also mentioned the smell of cleaner, since Kellen remembered it too. An investigator told him they found a jug of industrial solvent downstairs. It was used for stripping floors, but it also made tape stick better for a while. Weeks later, the county released a statement that charges were being considered. They didn't name suspects in public, but they confirmed a continuing inquiry. The church suspended counseling sessions and closed the basement to the public. Hollis resigned, citing health reasons, and Maris took a leave of absence. None of that felt like closure. It felt like a curtain drawn quickly. Teague kept thinking about the moment the lock snapped. He had expected an empty room and a minor code violation. Instead, he found a person waiting in the dark, trying not to panic. He wondered how many others had sat down there and stayed quiet. He wondered how many people believed it was for their own good. Kellen eventually moved away, according to a neighbor who spoke to Teague later. He didn't want to be known as the basement kid for the rest of his life. Teague respected that, and he never tried to contact him again. He kept his role small, just a witness who did his job. Still, the sound of that thump behind the door stayed with him. On certain mornings, Teague drove past the church on his way to inspections. The building looked the same from the street, steady and respectable. Sunlight hit the stained glass, and cars lined the curb for community events. But Teague knew what could be hidden behind a quiet hallway. He learned that safety wasn't only codes and rails, it was who held the keys. The stories. Paramedic who broke protocol after the storm. The run sheet said the call never happened, but 3 witnesses remembered the ambulance anyway. The medic who signed it broke protocol, and the storm was only part of the reason. In early September of 2019, Reeve Donlin was 39 and worked as a paramedic for a county EMS service. He lived in a small river town in the Midwest, where storms tore up trees and power lines every summer. That morning, the remnants of a hurricane had drifted inland, dumping rain hard for hours. By noon, the river spilled into streets, and the dispatch center started stacking calls like plates. Reeve showed up for a 12-hour shift with dry socks, extra gloves, and a calm face. His partner, Talia Mendez, was 27 and a brand new EMT who still checked everything twice. They stocked the truck, ran their radio check, and waited in the bay with doors open. The supervisor told crews to stage on high ground and avoid floodwater. No exceptions today. Reeve nodded like always, but his eyes stayed on the weather map taped to the wall. He had worked enough storms to know the map never showed the small disasters. Their first calls were simple: a fall in a dark stairwell, a diabetic who ran out of insulin. They moved slow because debris made every street feel like a maze. Around 4:30, the radio crackled with a priority tone that made Talia sit up straight. Dispatch gave an address near the river, then stopped and corrected it to a cross street. The dispatcher's voice sounded tight, like she had been arguing with someone off mic. The notes said, "Possible trapped person, caller unsure, water rising." The supervisor came on next and repeated the standing order about not entering flood zones. Reeve keyed up and asked if fire was en route for water rescue support. The supervisor said resources were thin and crews should not self-deploy into danger. Reeve acknowledged, then stared at the tablet, reading the caller number and name. The caller name matched someone Reeve recognized from a prior overdose call, a man named Kester Vale. Kester lived in a rental house near the river with a porch that sagged like a tired jaw. Reeve remembered Kester as loud, scared, and protective of his younger sister. That sister, Marlon Vale, had asthma and a heart condition, according to old chart notes. Reeve also remembered the last crew found their smoke detectors missing. Talia asked if they should stage at the edge and wait for fire, like they were told. Reeve said yes, but he turned the wheel toward the river anyway, taking the shortest route. They stopped where the pavement dipped into brown water and the barricade floated sideways. A neighbor waved both arms from a driveway, yelling something that the rain swallowed. Reeve got out, boots sinking in mud, and asked where the caller was. The neighbor pointed at the Vale house, and the porch light blinked like a weak heartbeat. Water covered the front steps, and the yard looked like a shallow lake. Kester stood at a window, banging on the glass with his palm, face pale and furious. Reeve walked closer until the water reached his knees, then stopped and assessed. He could see Marlin inside, sitting on the couch, shoulders hunched, breathing fast. Talia stayed by the truck, scanning for drifting debris and watching the water level. Reeve called fire dispatch on the radio and asked again for a rescue team. The dispatcher said units were tied up and an estimated arrival time was unknown. Kester slammed the window again and shouted, "She can't breathe! She's turning gray!" Reeve looked at Marlin's lips, and even through glass, he saw a bluish tint. Protocol said, "Wait, do not enter moving water, do not compromise the crew for one patient." Reeve knew the rule, and he had repeated it to rookies a dozen times. He also knew asthma did not politely pause while resources got sorted. He called his supervisor and described what he saw, then asked for permission to enter. The supervisor said no and added that any entry would be considered a direct violation. Reeve ended the call and took one more look at Marlin's posture and the panic in her eyes. He told Talia to keep the truck in place and to call for law and fire again. Talia asked if he was serious, and Reeve said, "Stay dry and keep eyes on me." Then he waded forward, one step at a time, feeling the push of water on his thighs. He reached the porch rail, grabbed it, and pulled himself to the door. Kester opened it fast, and the smell inside hit like wet carpet and old cigarettes. Reeve told Kester to move back, then stepped into ankle-deep water on the living room floor. Marlin tried to speak, but her words came out broken and thin. Reeve knelt beside her, checked her pulse, and listened to her lungs. The wheeze was tight, and her oxygen level on the finger clip was dropping fast. He reached for his kit and realized the bag was still with Talia at the truck. Reeve swore under his breath and asked Kester if they had any inhalers. Kester ran to a kitchen drawer and returned with a rescue inhaler with a cracked cap. Reeve checked the label and saw it was expired, but it was better than nothing. He coached Marlin through 2 puffs, then watched her chest keep fighting. Her breathing did not ease, and her hands started to tremble in a way Reeve did not like. He needed a nebulizer treatment and oxygen, and he needed it now. He asked Kester where the nearest high spot was, and Kester pointed toward a back window. Behind the house, the ground rose slightly, but the walkway was narrow and clogged with branches. Reeve decided to move Marlin out, even if it meant carrying her through water. He called to Talia through the open door, and his voice sounded small in the rain. Talia ran closer with the jump bag and the oxygen kit held over her head. She stopped at the waterline and looked at Reeve like she wanted to argue. Reeve told her to stay at the edge and hand him what he asked for. Talia slid the oxygen tubing and mask across the porch rail like a lifeline. Reeve put the mask on Marlin, opened the valve, and watched her shoulders loosen slightly. He set up the nebulizer with albuterol, hands steady even as water bumped his knees. Marlin's eyes stayed locked on him, desperate and trusting in a way that felt heavy. Kester hovered close, asking if she was dying, and Reeve told him to help by staying quiet. The treatment ran, and the wheeze softened, but it did not clear the way Reeve expected. That was when Reeve noticed bruising on Marlin's neck, faint fingerprints under damp hair. He did not react outwardly, but his mind filed it away with a cold click. He asked Marlin what happened before the breathing got bad, and she glanced at Kester first. Marlin said, "I slipped," then looked down, then added, "I fell in the hallway." Reeve asked where, and Marlin pointed toward a door that led to the back room. Reeve told Kester to keep holding the oxygen, then moved toward the back room carefully. He opened the door and saw a mattress on the floor, a space heater, and a chain lock on the inside. The chain lock was mounted high, like it was meant to keep someone in, not keep someone out. There was also a phone on the mattress with a cracked screen, and it was powered off. Reeve stood still, hearing the rain outside, and felt the call shift in his gut. He returned to Marlin and asked if she had called 911 herself. Marlin shook her head, then nodded, then said, "I tried, but it wouldn't work." Kester cut in and said the cell towers were down, and that was why he called from a neighbor. Reeve asked the neighbor's name, and Kester hesitated before answering. Talia caught that hesitation, and her eyes flicked to Reeve with a silent question. Marlin's breathing improved enough to move, so Reeve chose the back window exit. He and Kester carried her together, Reeve supporting her shoulders and Kester lifting her legs. They stepped into water again, pushing through branches, and Reeve kept talking to Marlin steadily. Talia followed along the higher edge, keeping oxygen flowing, watching for slips. They reached the small rise behind the house, where the mud was thick but not submerged. Reeve radioed that they had a patient and needed a clear route to transport. The supervisor replied with a clipped tone, asking why the crew entered the flood zone. Reeve said, "Patient was failing, no rescue resources available," and kept his voice controlled. The supervisor told them to return to staging and wait for fire to assist extraction. Reeve looked at Marlin, saw her lips still tinted, and decided he was done waiting. He loaded Marlin onto the stretcher on the high ground, then angled it toward a neighbor's driveway. The driveway sloped upward to dry pavement, and it was passable if they moved fast. They rolled the stretcher, wheels bouncing, while Kester ran ahead, clearing branches. Talia stayed near the head of the stretcher, keeping the mask sealed, face tense and focused. They got Marlin into the ambulance and started toward the hospital without lights to avoid debris panic. On the way, Reeve documented everything out loud so the dash audio captured it. He said arrival time, patient condition, oxygen levels, treatment given, and response observed. He also said noted bruising on neck, pattern consistent with grip, keeping the tone neutral. Talia stared at him, surprised, then looked back to Marlin, who had drifted into shallow sleep. Reeve called the receiving hospital and gave a report, including the bruising and the locked room. At the hospital, staff moved Marlin into a bay, placed monitors, and started additional breathing support. A nurse asked Kester to wait outside, and Kester argued until security stepped in. Reeve watched Kester's eyes, calculating and angry, then watched him step back too quickly. Talia whispered, "That didn't feel right," and Reeve nodded without looking at her. He finished the electronic chart, then paused at the signature line. Protocol violation meant the chart would draw attention, and attention meant questions about the house. Reeve had a choice, and he made it in a quiet, uncomfortable way. He entered the call as a different location, the dry driveway, not the flooded home. He left out the chain lock detail, and he described the bruising as possible injury from fall. Talia saw the entries and asked why he was softening it, and Reeve said, "Trust me for now." Back at the station, the supervisor called Reeve into an office and shut the door. He said the crew had endangered themselves and the truck, and the county could face liability. Reeve did not argue about the water, because the facts were the facts. He said the patient would have died if they waited, and he meant it. The supervisor said the run sheet looked clean enough, then asked who told Reeve about the address. That question landed wrong, like the supervisor cared more about blame than care. Reeve said dispatch gave it, and the supervisor said dispatch records were being audited. He warned Reeve not to freelance during a declared emergency, then dismissed him with a cold stare. Outside, Talia waited, and she asked if they were fired. Reeve told her no, but he said they needed to keep their own notes. Reeve went home and opened a notebook he kept for odd calls, writing the timeline carefully. He wrote the door chain detail, the powered-off phone, and Kester's hesitation about the neighbor. He also wrote that the supervisor seemed too eager for the chart to look tidy. The next day, he called an old friend who worked in hospital administration off the record. The friend said Marlin was stable, but she asked to speak to someone without family present. That was when the story cracked open into something larger than a storm call. According to a nurse statement later filed, Marlin said Kester had been keeping her inside. She reportedly said he took her phone, locked the back room, and used fear to control her. She also reportedly said the storm was his excuse because no one would come quickly. The nurse called social services, and law enforcement opened a separate inquiry. Reeve's run sheet, however, did not match the nurse timeline, and that mismatch mattered. A week later, Internal Affairs pulled radio traffic, dispatch logs, and the ambulance GPS history. They noticed the truck entered a restricted flood zone and stayed there for 17 minutes. The supervisor claimed he was never told the patient was in distress, which contradicted the recorded call. Reeve requested the audio, and when he heard it, he caught something that made his jaw tighten. There was a gap in the supervisor's radio response, like a clipped section, not just static. Reeve asked dispatch for the raw recording, not the stitched file used for review. A dispatcher named Cora Helvey met him in a coffee shop, careful and nervous. She said she was not supposed to share anything, but she hated what was happening. Cora said the supervisor had direct access to the recording system during emergencies. She also said he sometimes cleaned up audio when crews got complaints. Reeve did not record Cora, but he wrote down what she said, time and date included. He then requested a public records copy through the county clerk, using the proper process. The response came back with a note that certain files were exempt due to personnel review. That answer did not deny the files existed, and it did not confirm they were intact. Reeve kept pushing, not loudly, but steadily, the way he handled stubborn insurance forms. Meanwhile, detectives interviewed the neighbor who owned the driveway where Marlin was loaded. The neighbor confirmed Kester ran to his house and demanded to use his phone. He also said Kester was already soaked, like he had been in the water before calling. The neighbor said he heard shouting inside the Vale house earlier, before the worst rain. Those details showed up in witness statements, and they lined up with what Reeves suspected. The twist came from something small, and it came from Talia's attention to details. She remembered the cracked inhaler Kester handed over, and she remembered the pharmacy label. The label had Marlin's name, but it had a refill date from 2 months earlier. That meant Marlin had not been cut off from care, at least not entirely. It also meant someone was controlling her access in a way that looked normal on paper. Talia visited the pharmacy after her shift and spoke to a technician she knew from school. The technician said Kester picked up Marlin's meds most months, and he signed for them himself. He also asked for her records once, claiming insurance problems after a storm claim denial. That detail sounded like nothing, until Reeve connected it to his own job history. Reeve had inspected a roof on Kester's street the previous year and denied part of a claim. Reeve pulled his old claim notes and found a photo of the Vale house from that earlier visit. In the photo, the back window had bars that were not in the neighborhood norm. The report also mentioned smoke detectors missing, which could be another control tactic. Reeve realized Kester might have recognized him, then used the storm chaos to create leverage. The flood zone was not just danger, it was cover for a staged crisis. Reeve brought that information to detectives, along with his notebook and the official run sheet. He admitted he altered the chart, and he explained why he thought it mattered for safety. He said he feared the supervisor would bury the locked room detail, and he was partly right. Detectives requested the ambulance dash audio, and the unedited file included his spoken notes. That audio captured the bruising observation clearly, and it matched the timestamps. When the county finally released the raw radio file under legal pressure, the gap was obvious. Experts later said it looked like a manual edit, not a transmission drop. The supervisor was placed on leave, then later resigned before a formal hearing concluded. No one publicly called it a cover-up, but the paperwork language was careful and pointed. Reeve was disciplined for the protocol breach, but he kept his license after review. Kester was charged in a separate case, based on Marlin's statements and corroborating evidence. The storm did not cause the bruises, and it did not install a chain lock on a bedroom. Reeve's choice to enter the water was still a violation, and he accepted that fact. But his larger break from protocol was quieter, the choice to keep notes beyond the system. Those notes helped unwind what the storm tried to hide. Months later, Reeve returned to that same river road on a dry afternoon. The Vale house looked smaller in daylight, and the porch rail had been replaced. Reeve did not go up to the door, and he did not need to. He sat in his truck for a minute, then drove away, thinking about rules and reality. In the end, the storm was loud, but the real danger was the silence people edited in. The stories. The bus driver who turned back years later. The route ended early, and the radio kept talking after the bus went silent. Years later, the same driver returned to the last stop and found out why. Dorian Klein was 44 and worked weekday mornings for a regional transit contractor. He drove a long commuter loop through timber towns, then back toward the highway. That Tuesday started like any other, with coffee in a paper cup and a schedule clipped to plastic. He planned to finish the loop, fuel up, and be home before dark. The town was small enough that Dorian recognized most riders by their shoes. A nurse with squeaky clogs, a mill worker with orange earplugs, a student with a sketchbook. They nodded at him like he was part of the scenery, which he liked. The bus was old, but it ran, and the heater worked. His biggest worry that morning was a fog bank near the river bridge. Dispatch called him once to confirm a detour around a washout, and he read it back cleanly. The road was narrow, with tall firs and no shoulder in spots. Dorian kept both hands steady and watched for deer, then for loose gravel. The bus climbed into higher ground where cell service dropped to nothing. He passed the last convenience store and felt that familiar quiet settle in. At 11:30, he reached the turnaround near an abandoned rest area. It was a patch of cracked asphalt, a closed bathroom building, and a picnic table that leaned sideways. The map called it a stop, but nobody used it anymore. It existed for the timetable, not for people. Dorian opened the doors out of habit, waited 10 seconds, then closed them again. That was when he saw the backpack in the aisle, sitting upright like someone had placed it carefully. It was a plain gray bag, not one he recognized from earlier. Dorian checked the mirrors, then looked at his passenger count sheet. The bus was empty. And it had been empty since the last drop-off by the mill gate. He remembered the last rider getting off, because the kid thanked him twice. Dorian walked back and touched the backpack with 2 fingers, like it might be hot. It was heavier than it looked, and something inside clinked softly. He set it on the front seat, then keyed the radio. He told dispatch there was a lost bag and asked if anyone had called in. Dispatch said nobody had reported anything yet and told him to bring it to the depot. He should have just turned around, but he noticed a smell when he lifted it again. It was sharp, like pool cleaner, mixed with something sweet and wrong. Dorian hesitated, then unzipped the top a few inches. Inside was a plastic bottle with a rag stuffed into the neck and a second bottle taped to it. There were also matchbooks and a folded paper with a hand-drawn diagram. Dorian zipped it shut fast, and his throat went dry. He backed away and stared at the bag like it could move. He keyed the radio again, and this time his voice came out thin. He told dispatch the bag looked dangerous, and he needed instructions right now. Dispatch asked what kind of dangerous, and Dorian said he did not want to describe it over an open channel. Dispatch told him to pull off the route and wait for law enforcement. Dorian said there was nowhere safe to pull off, and the rest area was closed. Dispatch told him to stay put, doors locked, and keep the radio open. Dorian did what he was told and tried not to look at the backpack. He turned off the engine to save fuel, then turned it back on because the quiet made his ears ring. Fog rolled between the trees, and the rest area sign creaked in the wind. He watched the road in the mirror, expecting headlights, but the road stayed empty. After 10 minutes, the radio crackled, then went dead for a moment. Dorian thought he heard someone breathing on the line, then a click, then silence again. He pressed the talk button and asked dispatch to confirm. Dispatch answered, but the reply sounded delayed, like the words were coming through water. A car appeared from the trees, not on the road, but in the gravel lot behind the closed bathrooms. Dorian had not heard it arrive. It was an older sedan with no front plate, and its paint looked dull, almost dusty. A person stepped out, hood up, hands in pockets, walking slow toward the bus. Dorian locked the doors again, even though they were already locked. He picked up the radio mic and told dispatch someone was approaching the bus from the rear lot. Dispatch told him to stay inside and asked for a description. Dorian said the person looked average height, bulky jacket, face not visible. The person kept coming, and Dorian felt his heartbeat in his fingertips. The person reached the side of the bus and knocked once, then twice, polite and steady. Dorian did not answer, and the person knocked again, then pressed their forehead to the glass. Dorian could not see eyes under the hood, only a shadow and the outline of a nose. The person pointed at the backpack on the front seat, then made a slow, twisting motion with their hand, like turning a key. Dorian shook his head hard, then mouthed no, and backed away. The person tapped the glass and pointed again, more urgent. Then they stepped away, walked to the front of the bus, and crouched near the wheel well. Dorian lost sight of them, and panic spread through him like heat. He told dispatch the person was at the front of the bus, and then the engine coughed. The dashboard lights flickered, and the bus shuddered as if someone had tugged a cable. Dorian reached for the door switch to force the doors open, thinking he might run, but the switch did nothing. He tried the emergency lever, and it stuck halfway. The bus horn blared once without his hands on it, loud and sudden, then went quiet. Dorian heard a metallic scrape under the floor, near the front axle. He grabbed the fire extinguisher and held it like a bat. He kept his eyes on the windshield, waiting for the hooded person to reappear. Instead, he saw the sedan roll slowly into view, now on the road, moving away. The hooded person was behind the wheel, and the car picked up speed as it disappeared into fog. The bus sat there, trembling, and Dorian realized the backpack was still on the seat. He also realized dispatch had stopped talking. He pressed the mic and shouted, asking if anyone was on the line. The radio gave only a hiss, then a broken fragment of speech, like a recording clipped mid-sentence. Dorian sat down hard and tried to breathe through his nose. He stared at the backpack and wondered if the person had tried to disable the bus to get it back. A state trooper arrived almost 40 minutes later, lights flashing through the fog. Another unit came behind, and then a county deputy. Dorian watched them approach with caution, hands visible, weapons low, but ready. They ordered him out, moved him away from the bus, and asked him to sit on the asphalt with his hands on his knees. His legs shook so badly he could not stand straight. The trooper entered the bus with gloves on and carried the backpack out like it was alive. The deputy asked Dorian to repeat everything, and Dorian did, word by word. He told them about the smell, the diagram, the hooded person, the strange radio delay. He told them he had not touched anything after the first unzip. The deputy nodded, but his eyes stayed flat. They shut the road down for hours and brought in a specialist from another county. Dorian saw them place the backpack in a thick container and load it into a truck. They never told him exactly what it was, only that he did the right thing. The rest area stayed closed, and his route was canceled for the day. Dorian went home and sat in his kitchen until dawn, still hearing the knock in his head. He returned to work 2 days later, then quit before the month ended. He told people he could not handle the mountain roads anymore, and that was mostly true. He found a job as a freight dispatcher, where the worst thing that happened was a missed pickup. The bus company replaced him, and the route kept running, but Dorian avoided that highway like it was cursed. Time did what it always does, and the story turned into a rumor. Some people claimed it was a bomb. Others said it was drugs. Others said it was nothing. Dorian never corrected anyone because he did not have proof, only memory. He tried to file an information request once, but the response came back thin and redacted. After a while, he stopped trying. In the summer of 2023, Dorian got a letter with the county seal on it. It was brief and careful, inviting him to speak with an investigator about the old incident. The name on the letter was not a detective name, but an analyst, someone who worked cold files and archived records. Dorian almost threw it away, but curiosity won. The meeting took place in a plain office behind the courthouse with bad carpet and fluorescent lights. The analyst was a woman in her 50s named Maris Velton. She had wireframe glasses and a calm voice that never rose. She did not act like someone chasing headlines, more like someone cleaning up an old mess. Maris asked Dorian to tell the story again, and he did. She listened without interrupting, writing notes in neat block letters. When he finished, she nodded once and slid a folder across the table. Inside were photocopies of dispatch logs, a grainy still frame from a bus camera, and a map printout with circles drawn in pen. Dorian looked at the still frame first, and his stomach tightened. It showed the hooded person by the glass, head tilted, finger pointing toward the front seat. The camera timestamp read 11:37, and the image was clearer than Dorian expected. The person wore gloves, and the hood shadowed the face, but the shape of the jacket was distinct. Dorian recognized the bulk at the shoulders, like thick padding. Maris tapped the dispatch logs with her finger and said the radio delay was real. The audio had been recorded at the dispatch center, and the waveform showed dropouts. The recording also contained an odd segment, a brief voice that was not dispatch. It sounded like a man, speaking low, saying, "Turn the key and come back." Dorian felt his skin prickle because that was the exact gesture the hooded person made. He asked Maris who said it, and she said they did not know. The channel was supposed to be secure, but on that stretch, it could be reached by a strong enough handheld. Maris said the voice might have been close to the bus, using the terrain to push signal. Maris then showed him the map and asked if he had ever looked behind the rest area bathrooms. Dorian said he saw the sedan back there and nothing else. Maris said deputies searched the area that day, but their search was limited by fog and time. She said a new search had been done recently, after a forestry crew found something odd during brush clearing. Dorian asked what they found, and Maris paused before answering. She said they found a shallow cache, wrapped in tarp, buried under old gravel. Inside were several items, including bus schedules, matchbooks, and a set of gloves with rubberized palms. There was also a small notebook with a hand-drawn diagram that matched Dorian's description. Dorian swallowed and asked why this was coming up now. Maris said the notebook included dates and route numbers that continued beyond the day Dorian stopped driving. It looked like planning for later attempts that never happened. Maris said the person might have been practicing or waiting for a better opportunity. The sudden stop may have forced them to abandon the cache. Dorian asked if they ever identified the person, and Maris said they had a lead, but it was incomplete. She said a traffic camera on the highway caught the sedan later that day, but the plate was unreadable. However, a repair shop invoice had surfaced years later, connected to a similar car with a cracked headlight. The customer used cash and a false name, but the shop kept a copy of a handwritten note. Maris slid another photocopy across the table. It was a short note, written in sloppy print, asking for a quick fix and a return pickup at the old rest area. At the bottom was a signature that looked like two initials, then a last name. Dorian stared at it and felt a strange jolt of recognition, like seeing a face in a crowd. He told Maris the last name matched the mill gate where he dropped off the last rider that morning. The mill had a security desk, and Dorian remembered the guard's name tag because it was unusual. The name on the note was the same. Dorian's mouth went dry as he said it out loud. Maris nodded, like she had been waiting for that connection. She said the old mill had kept shift rosters, and one guard with that last name had worked there briefly. The guard left after a complaint about erratic behavior and missing tools. The guard also lived near the bus route in a rural rental with a shed. Years later, the guard died in an accident, and the property was sold. Dorian asked if they searched the shed, and Maris said they did, after getting permission from the new owner. She said they found nothing dramatic, but they did find a box of old transit tokens and a handheld radio with a modified antenna. They also found a jacket with padded shoulders, and the fabric matched the camera still. Maris said it was not enough for a case, but it was enough to answer questions. Dorian sat back and tried to process it, because the fear had never had a shape before. He asked why the person wanted the backpack back so badly. Maris said the evidence suggested it was not meant to be used on the bus itself. It was meant to be carried off at a later stop, possibly handed to someone else. The rest area was a meeting point, not a target. Maris said the diagram showed fuel storage locations, not inside the bus, but near a maintenance yard. It looked like sabotage planning aimed at equipment, not people. That mattered, but it did not make Dorian feel better. Dorian said the person still tried to trap him, and Maris agreed. She said the person likely panicked when the bag was discovered early and tried to recover it at any cost. Dorian asked about the strange moment with the horn and the door switch. Maris said technicians inspected the bus afterward and found the battery cable had been pulled loose. She said it could have been vibration, but it was unlikely. The scrape Dorian heard matched the position where someone could reach under and yank it. The horn could have triggered as voltage dropped, like a dying gasp. Dorian's hands started shaking again, and he clasped them tightly. He asked why the person drove away instead of fighting harder. Maris said the arriving patrol units were seen by the sedan driver before they reached the rest area. A watcher could have been posted down the road, or the driver could have heard sirens echo. The safest choice was to flee and leave the cache for later. Dorian stared at the bus camera still again and noticed something he never saw before. The hooded person's glove had a tear at the thumb, and a strip of pale skin showed. Dorian remembered that the mill guard with the unusual name had a bandage on his thumb once, back when Dorian still drove that route. Dorian could not be sure it was the same person, but the memory hit like cold water. Maris asked Dorian why he came back to this now, after so many years. Dorian said he did not choose it, the letter did. Maris said he did choose it because he walked into the office. Dorian looked at her and gave a small, tired smile. He told Maris the truth, which was that the unfinished part had followed him for years. It was not the backpack, or the fog, or even the knock. It was the moment the radio seemed to breathe. like someone was already inside the line. He said it made him feel watched in a way he could not explain. Maris said sometimes the mind saves the sharpest details because they matter. Before Dorian left, Maris asked if he wanted to see the rest area again. Dorian surprised himself by saying yes, but not alone. 2 days later, Maris and a deputy met him at the old turnout in clear weather. The bathrooms were still boarded, and weeds pushed through the asphalt cracks. The place looked smaller than it did in memory. They walked behind the building where the sedan had been, and the deputy pointed to a patch of disturbed gravel. Dorian saw the shallow pit where the cache had been, now filled in again. He looked at the trees and listened to the wind, waiting for a knock that did not come. In daylight, it felt like any abandoned place, lonely and ordinary. Maris showed him the exact spot where the bus had parked, marked by a faded paint line. She asked him to stand there and look at the road, and Dorian did. He imagined the hooded figure, the radio hiss, the dead channel. He imagined the moment he chose to unzip the bag and the moment he chose to zip it back up. Dorian realized that small choices were the whole story. If he had ignored the bag, it might have been carried off later. If he had opened it fully, something could have spilled or sparked. If he had opened the doors to speak with the hooded person, the person might have gotten inside. The route could have ended in a different kind of silence. The deputy told Dorian they were closing the old file as far as they could. They had a likely suspect, but no living person to charge, and no clear proof of an intended crime. The evidence would be preserved, and the maintenance yards had new security measures now. Dorian nodded, because that was as close to an ending as reality often gave. On the drive back, Dorian watched the trees slide past and felt his shoulders relax for the first time in years. The fear did not vanish, but it shrank into something he could carry without dropping everything else. He had come back, and the place did not swallow him. He had faced the last stop, and it stayed quiet. That night, Dorian slept with the window cracked, and the cold air felt clean. He still dreamed of the knock sometimes, but now the dream had edges. It was no longer a faceless force in fog, it was a person making desperate choices. Dorian did not forgive that person, but he finally understood the shape of it. The next morning, Dorian drove to work in his own car and merged onto the highway without flinching. He watched a city bus pull into a stop and open its doors, ordinary and loud. For a moment, he imagined the driver inside, doing the job, trusting the schedule, trusting the radio. Dorian hoped that driver never had to turn back years later, just to learn why.